Hi, so in today's class we are going to talk about data and metadata. Following up from the previous class on data model, we'll talk more about data and metadata. So data and metadata are two important concepts of how data is stored in OpenMRS. The actual information that you want to record about a patient is stored is called as data. So examples of data are patients, encounters, observations. But to support this data, we need other kinds of information about that data, and any information about data or more descriptive information about data is known as metadata. So, to talk about data, when a user deletes a piece of data in OpenMRS, the information is actually still stored in the database, and what happens is it is marked as voided. When you void a piece of data, it does not show up on the user interface, but it is still stored in the database. For example, if someone was suffering from cough and by mistake I typed in woofing cough, I wanted to remove that information for the observation about the patient. So, what happens is I void that observation that I just made, and then I again capture fever or cough, and then I store that as the current observation. But the previous observation of woofing cough is still stored in the system. And the reason to do this is that we want to be able to audit the system. So, if it is done by accident, then the administrator can unvoid that information and bring it back. So, all changes in the system, all changes to data are tracked in the system and can be used for auditing purposes. So, anyone who changes any information, that person's information is also stored in. So, there are things like voided by, voided date that are also stored in the data model as part of the row for observations. To permanently delete data from a database, an administrator can also purge data. Typically, this should never be done in a production system because you want to do auditing of the data that has been captured. Only in very limited cases where there is a blatant problem with data where the capturing of that information was completely incorrect is when you want to purge information. But in production systems, you never want to purge any data. Moving on to metadata, the things that you need to configure in order to describe the real patient information. For example, if I was capturing that someone had cough, the concept of cough would become metadata, and the observation of yes, no about the cough will be stored as data. So, that is the difference between data and metadata. So, which means concepts are stored in the system as metadata, and the yes or no about that patient's observation becomes the data. An example of metadata is also location. For example, an observation was captured in a particular clinic or in a particular ward in an inpatient setting. So, that would become the metadata about that observation. So, things like forms, concepts, patient attribute types are all examples of metadata in the system. An administrator may also retire metadata, just like you can void observations or data. Similarly, you can retire a location or metadata. This does not mean that the metadata is permanently deleted from the system, but rather it is not intended for further use, which means all the old information that was captured based on that metadata still remains in the system, but there is no new information that can be captured using that metadata, which means the old data can still be used for analysis purposes, but it cannot be used to update new information. So, that is the idea of being able to void data and to retire metadata. Similarly, you can also unretire metadata once you want to again reuse it, but in production systems these should be avoided because once a metadata has been retired, you want to create a new version of the metadata and then capture data. So, instead of unretiring data, you want to create a new version of the metadata and capture information in it. Also, like I said, if there is no actual data that is available for that metadata, you may want to purge the metadata. So, there is the option to purge metadata when it is not going to be used again, and there is no existing data that has been captured for that metadata. For example, a hospital you refer to patients closes down. Therefore, you no longer refer patients to that clinic or that location. But the existing observations that have been captured in that location still want to be used for analysis purposes. So you would not invalidate the fact that previous patient's information or previous information about the patient was captured in the old location. So whenever you see retired or retired by in any of the data model tables, it means that these are about metadata. Whenever you see the columns voided or voided by in the date tables, it means that it is a data table. So that's how you can distinguish between if it's a table about data or metadata. So if you go back to the data model by clicking on this, can you now identify if it is data or metadata? Let us try to go through a few examples. Let us try to look at say cohort and try to understand if this is data or metadata. So can anyone guess what it is? So what I think is, and the way you should identify this is when you look at voided or voided by existing in the cohort table, it means it is metadata, right? Because you have voided or unvoided. Sorry, it is data because it has the voided and the voided by tables columns in the table. So that's it for the class today. Thank you so much.